The dust in Cedar Hollow had a taste. It was red and fine, a mixture of Montana soil and the future. It settled on everything, a gritty film over the raw lumber of the general store, the canvas tops of freight wagons, and the hopeful glass of the new church windows. The town was wedged in a crease of the mountains, a place of sharp edges and long shadows. Above, the peaks held on to their snow well into the spring, and below, the branches of Dry Creek were a pale, stony skeleton waiting for the thaw that was slow to come. The air carried the scent of pine pitch, curing leather from the smithy, and the acrid smell of tar from the railroad ties being laid a mile down the valley. That new sound, the shriek of a steam whistle testing the line, cut through the familiar tolling of the church bell, a promise of progress that felt more like a threat to the town's quiet rhythms. Eliza Hart felt the dust in her throat as she walked from the small room she rented to the converted barn that served as both the town's school and library. At 24, she carried herself with a stillness that belonged to someone much older. Her father, a man who had loved books more than business, had left her with a shelf of poetry and a crippling debt to the Cedar Hollow Bank and Trust. He had been sick, his mind clouded. When Mercer Hale had placed the papers before him, alone. Hale had called it a simple matter to see him through the winter, but the ink, Eliza knew, had been poison. It had bound their small plot of land, their future, to the railroad's insatiable appetite for territory, an appetite Hale was paid handsomely to feed. Now her father was gone, laid to rest in the frozen ground, and the debt remained, a cold stone in Eliza's life. She taught the children their letters and sums, her voice calm and even, but her mind was always on the ledger. Every dollar she earned mending shirts or writing letters for those who could not was a drop of water against a wildfire. Mercer Hale made sure she understood this. He was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, a representative of the bank and an agent of the railroad, two heads of the same devouring serpent. He spoke of community and charity, but his true currency was desperation. His latest charitable endeavor was a matchmaking social to be held in the church. A chance, he announced from the Sunday pulpit, for the lonely bachelors and hard-working men of the territory to find worthy helpmeets, and for the unburdened spinsters and widows of Cedar Hollow to find security. But everyone knew its true purpose. It was an auction block for the indebted, a way for Hale to wrap the chains of debt in the ribbon of holy matrimony, ensuring the land and labor he coveted would never slip from his grasp. Eliza had been informed, not asked, that her presence was required. Her father's debt, Hale had explained with that chillingly gentle voice, made her a prime candidate for a beneficial union. That same afternoon, a man came down from the mountains. He moved not like a townsman, but like a piece of the wilderness itself, detached and purposeful. Jonah Creed was 35, though the hard lines on his face and the silver in his dark hair could have added 10 years. Old scars, faint white tracks, mapped a history on his skin, one across his brow, another that cut through his left eyebrow, and a wicked one that disappeared into the collar of his worn leather coat. He led a pack horse laden with expertly bundled beaver and fox pelts. 10 years he had lived alone on Elk Trace Pass, coming to town only when necessity demanded it. A ghost from the high country. 10 years since the feud with the Kellerman family had ended in fire and bloodshed, leaving him branded by rumors he never bothered to deny. He sold his furs to the trader, his words few and his voice a low rumble, the sound of rocks shifting deep underground. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and a box of cartridges for his rifle. As he was leaving the general store, the sound of forced cheer drew his eyes toward the church. He saw the crowd gathering, the nervous energy of the women being herded inside, the predatory eagerness of the men. And he saw Mercer Hale, immaculate in his city suit, standing at the door like a spider welcoming flies into his parlor. Jonah's jaw tightened. He knew Hale. He knew his methods. He had seen what the railroad and its agents did to the land and the people who lived on it. He turned to walk toward his horse, his business in this town concluded. But then he saw Eliza Hart. She was standing near the church steps, her hands clenched at her sides. There was no hope in her face, only a quiet, resolute dread. He had seen her before, on his rare trips to town, a slender woman with eyes the color of a stormy sky. He had seen her reading to the children in the shade of the livery stable, her voice a soft murmur against the summer heat. There was a gentleness about her that seemed as out of place in Cedar Hollow as a wildflower in a rock slide. He saw Hale approach her, his hand touching her elbow in a gesture of proprietary ownership. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tremor. And in that moment, Jonah Creed's plans changed. Inside the church, the pews were filled. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and nervous perfume. Mercer Hale stood on the dais, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. He spoke of building families, of strengthening the community, of divine providence. Eliza stood with 3 other women, all of them bound by the same invisible chains of debt. She felt the eyes of the men in the pews on her, assessing her worth like livestock. When her name was called, she walked to the center of the platform as if in a dream. Mercer Hale began to speak of her virtues. A fine teacher, he said, a woman of good breeding, despite her unfortunate circumstances. He mentioned the debt, framing it as a small obstacle a respectable husband could easily overcome for the reward of such a companion. He opened the bidding, not with dollars, but with acres of land, heads of cattle, and promises of position. A rancher with a weathered face and cruel eyes made an offer. A shopkeeper, sweating in his wool suit, raised it. Eliza stared at a crack in the floorboards, praying for the earth to open and swallow her. This was not a marriage proposal. It was the foreclosure of her life. And then the church doors swung open, letting in a rectangle of harsh afternoon light. Jonah Creed stood silhouetted in the doorway. He took a moment to scan the room, his gaze unreadable. Before walking down the central aisle, the whispers and murmurs died as he moved. He did not stop until he stood before the dais, his shadow falling over Mercer Hale. He ignored Hale completely, his eyes fixed on Eliza. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy deerskin pouch. He tossed it onto the small table beside the preacher. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the silent church. The pouch sagged, spilling a small stream of coarse gold dust. "I will cover the debt," Jonah said. His voice was quiet, yet it filled the entire space. "We will be married." A collective gasp went through the congregation. Mercer Hale's face, a mask of pleasantry moments before, hardened into a snarl of disbelief and fury. "This is a charitable social, Mr. Creed, not a saloon brawl. There are procedures." Jonah's gaze shifted to Hale, and for the first time, Eliza saw the cold fire that lived in the mountain man's eyes. It was a look that promised violence without raising a hand. "The debt is paid," Jonah stated, leaving no room for argument. "The woman is free of it. She will marry me." He looked at the preacher, a young man who seemed to shrink under his stare. Now, the preacher looked helplessly at Hale, who was momentarily speechless with rage, but the gold was on the table. A fortune in raw dust, far more than the value of Eliza's debt. To refuse it would be to admit the entire event was a sham, a truth the town tacitly accepted but would never voice. The law, however twisted Hale might make it, was technically on Jonah's side. A debt was paid. A proposal was made. The choice, supposedly, belonged to Eliza. All eyes turned to her. She looked from Hale's murderous face to Jonah Creed's impassive one. He was a stranger, a man they called a killer, a wild animal from the mountains. But in his eyes, she did not see the hunger she saw in the other men. She saw a quiet intensity, a strange sort of honor. He was not offering her love or happiness. He was offering her an escape. It was a choice between a gilded cage and a leap into the unknown wilderness. "I accept," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The wedding was a blur. The preacher's words were rushed, his hands trembling as he read from the book. The townspeople whispered behind their hands. The old stories about Jonah Creed and the Kellerman boys catching fire once more. They said he was a beast who lived in a cave, that he had killed 3 men with his bare hands. They said he had bought himself a wife because no sane woman would have him. Mercer Hale watched from the front pew, his eyes like chips of ice, his mind already plotting how to reclaim what he considered his stolen property. Jonah stood beside her, a silent, solid presence. He did not touch her until the preacher told him to. His hand was rough and calloused as it took hers, his fingers gently closing around her own. When the ceremony was over, there were no congratulations, only a thick, expectant silence. Jonah turned, his hand still holding hers, and led her down the aisle and out of the church, away from the whispers and the stares. He wordlessly helped her onto his horse, then mounted his own. He did not look back at the town or the people who watched them go. As they began the long ride up the winding trail toward Elk Trace Pass, Eliza dared a glance over her shoulder. Cedar Hollow was already shrinking below them, the church steeple a tiny spear against the darkening sky. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, riding into an untamed wilderness with a man she did not know, a man with a fearsome reputation. Fear coiled in her stomach, cold and sharp, but as the horse climbed higher and the clean, cold mountain air filled her lungs, it was mingled with something else, something she had not felt in a very long time, a fragile, terrifying sliver of hope. She was in debt to this man now, but it was a different kind of debt. She was no longer property. She was, for the first time in a year, free. The cabin on Elk Trace Pass was not a beast's den. It was a small, solid house built with a careful hand. The logs were expertly notched, sealed so tightly against the wind that a man could not slip a knife blade between them. Inside, a large stone fireplace took up most of one wall, its hearth swept clean. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room, and shelves holding tin plates. A few books and jars of dried herbs lined the walls. A bed, built into the far corner, was piled with thick wool blankets and a bearskin hide. Patches of ice, stubborn remnants of a long winter, still clung to the shaded earth outside the single window. Beyond a small, tilled patch of soil meant for potatoes, the forest pressed in on all sides, a vast, silent world of pine and rock. This was Eliza's new home. The first night, a silent agreement was made without a single word. After a meal of jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, Jonah laid a fresh log on the fire, took a blanket from the bed, and settled himself on the long, low bench that ran beneath the window. He gave her the bed without question, a gesture of respect that spoke more than any polite conversation could have. In the flickering firelight, she watched the rise and fall of his broad back as he slept. A man who was her husband in name only, a stranger who had bought her freedom and now stood guard over it. The days found a rhythm, dictated not by the town clock but by the sun and the needs of survival. This was the breath of the mountain, a slow, deep inhale and exhale that began to soothe the frantic pounding of her heart. Jonah rose before the sun, his movements quiet and economical. He would already be outside splitting wood when she awoke, the steady thud of his axe a kind of heartbeat for their mornings. He showed her how to properly bank the fire at night so a bed of hot coals remained in the morning, how to work the bellows to bring the flames back to life. He taught her which streams ran clear enough to drink from and how to filter the water through layers of cloth and charcoal just to be certain. Her hands, accustomed to the smooth paper of books and the fine needlework of a schoolteacher, grew rough. She learned to cook on the wood stove, a temperamental beast of iron that was either too hot or too cold. She found a small, leather-bound journal on a shelf, its pages filled with elegant script. It had belonged to Jonah's mother. Inside were recipes for sourdough starter, instructions for canning wild berries, and detailed drawings of plants with notes on their medicinal uses. Yarrow for fevers, willow bark for pain, comfrey for mending bones. The book became her Bible. It was a connection to the man who remained a mystery, a glimpse into the life he had known before the silence and the scars. She mended the tears in his shirts, her stitches small and neat, and felt as if she were mending some small tear in the fabric of their strange, shared existence. Jonah spoke little, but when he did, his words were practical. "This is how you set a snare for a rabbit. We will plant the beans here, where they get the morning sun. The wolves are hungry after the winter, so keep the door barred at night." He moved with a deep and abiding knowledge of the wild, a quiet confidence that was both intimidating and deeply reassuring. He kept his promise, sleeping on the bench every night, never crossing the invisible line he had drawn between them. The space in the small cabin was both immense and intimate. They moved around each other in a careful dance, their lives intertwined by necessity, their inner worlds still miles apart. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the trail below the cabin. It was Nate Walker, a tall, lean black man with kind eyes and a face that had seen 1,000 miles of trail dust. He had driven cattle up from Kansas in his youth and now worked a small ranch in the neighboring valley. He was one of the few people who did not fear Jonah Creed. He dismounted and greeted Jonah with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Brought you some news and a bit of salt pork," Nate said, handing over a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Figured you might be tired of your own cooking." His eyes found Eliza, and his smile widened with genuine warmth. "Not pity or suspicion, ma'am. Good to see a bit of grace has found its way up this mountain." Jonah made coffee, and the three of them sat at the table. Nate spoke of town matters, of the railroad pushing through, of a new strain of fever that had taken hold down in the flats. The townspeople, he reported, were in an uproar over the wedding. "Mercer Hale's putting it about that Jonah here snatched you right off the church steps," Nate said, his gaze steady on Eliza. "He's painting a real ugly picture. Says you're a prisoner up here." Eliza felt a flash of anger. "I am no one's prisoner," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Mr. Creed paid my father's debt. I came of my own free will." Nate nodded slowly. "I believe you, ma'am, but Hale's got folks listening. He's a man who don't like to lose." Later that week, Jonah announced they were low on flour. The trip to Cedar Hollow was unavoidable. As they rode down the mountain, Eliza felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The town, once her whole world, now felt like enemy territory. The whispers started the moment they reached the main street. People stopped and stared. Women pulled their children close as if Jonah were a contagion. Eliza, who had once been greeted with respectful nods, was now the subject of scornful looks and hushed, cruel comments. The wild man's wife. "Look at her, poor thing." They saw Mrs. Lin, the Chinese woman who ran a small laundry and sold herbal remedies from her back room. A group of rough-looking men from the railroad camp were standing outside her shop, making loud, insulting remarks. Mrs. Lin ignored them with a placid dignity, her face a calm mask, but Eliza saw the tension in her hands. Jonah guided his horse closer, and the sheer presence of him, his cold stare promising nothing but trouble, was enough to make the men shuffle away. Grumbling, Mrs. Lin gave Jonah a slight, almost imperceptible bow of her head, a silent acknowledgement between two of the town's outcasts. Eliza felt a kinship with her, a shared understanding of what it meant to be on the outside. Their last stop was the general store. Pinned to the notice board outside was a new poster, the ink still fresh. Eliza's blood ran cold when she read it. It was a wanted notice, a $500 reward for information leading to the arrest of Jonah Creed, for the crime of abducting Eliza Hart, issued by the territorial marshal at the request of Mercer Hale, acting on behalf of the concerned citizens of Cedar Hollow. It was a lie, a vicious, calculated lie, but it had the weight of the law behind it. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to turn a neighbor into a bounty hunter. It was enough to get a man killed. Jonah tore the poster from the board, crumpled it in his fist, and dropped it into the dust. He bought their flour without a word, and they rode out of town. The weight of that lie heavy in the air between them. The sanctuary of the mountain no longer felt so secure. The world, it seemed, would not leave them alone. The following days were tense. Jonah spent more time watching the trails, his rifle never far from his hand. The silence between them grew, but it was a different kind of silence now, filled with the unspoken threat from the world below. Eliza found herself watching him, studying the way he moved, the way he listened to the forest sounds, the deep sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. One evening, after supper, he took a clean, empty tin can and set it on a stump 50 yards from the cabin. He held his rifle out to her. "You need to learn," he said simply. Eliza had never held a firearm in her life. It was heavy, alien in her hands, a tool of violence. But she thought of the poster, of Mercer Hale's cold eyes, of the men who had taunted Mrs. Lynn. She thought of the $500 price on the head of the man who had saved her. He stood behind her, his voice a low murmur near her ear. He did not touch her, but she could feel the warmth of his body, a solid presence at her back. He showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to line up the sights, how to breathe out slow and steady before squeezing the trigger. "Don't pull it," he said. "Squeeze it, gentle, like you're shaking a man's hand." Her first shot went wide, kicking up dirt a foot to the left of the stump. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder. A painful, surprising jolt. The explosion of the shot echoed off the mountains, a shocking violation of the evening quiet. "Again," Jonas said, his voice calm. She reloaded, her fingers clumsy. She tried to remember everything he had said. Brace it firm, sights level, breathe, squeeze. The second shot was closer, splintering the edge of the stump. Again. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. She lined up the small metal bead on the end of the barrel with the notch in the rear sight, centering the distant, gleaming tin can within them. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of focus. She squeezed the trigger. There was a loud, satisfying ping. The can flew off the stump, tumbling through the air before landing in the tall grass. She had hit it, a thrill, sharp and unexpected, shot through her. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder aching, her ears ringing, but a smile touched her lips. She looked at Jonah. The corner of his mouth was turned up in what might have been the shadow of a smile himself. It was just a tin can, but in that moment, standing in the fading light on the edge of the vast wilderness, Eliza Hart felt a new and unfamiliar power settle within her. It was the dawning of a confidence she never knew she could possess. She was no longer just a schoolteacher in debt. She was a woman who could stand her ground. She was a woman who could learn to survive. And she would. The wanted poster had changed the air on the mountain. It was thinner, sharper. Every snap of a twig in the forest sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a gun. The quiet solitude that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like an exposed position. It was during this time of tense waiting that Eliza made her discovery. She was trying to organize the sparse contents of a small cupboard built into the wall next to the hearth, a space for storing dried goods and linens. One of the rough-hewn pine boards at the back felt loose to the touch. Curious. She worked her fingers into the seam, prying gently until the board came free. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against oilcloth. She pulled out a flat, wrapped package. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It was not something Jonah would have hidden. His life was plain and open. Everything he owned was in sight. This was a secret. She unwrapped the package on the table. Inside were 2 items, a thin ledger book and a folded letter. The letter was addressed to no one. The paper was stiff, and a large, dark, reddish-brown stain marred the bottom corner. Soaking through the pages, it was unmistakably blood. With trembling hands, she unfolded it. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smudged in places. It was from Abel Morris, the head accountant at the Cedar Hollow Bank and Trust. Eliza had known him. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had always greeted her father with a respectful tip of his hat. The letter was a confession and an accusation. Morris wrote that he could no longer live with what he had done. He detailed how Mercer Hale had systematically embezzled money from a federal relief fund meant for families hit by drought and fever. He wrote of a second set of books, a phantom ledger that documented the true flow of money into Hale's pockets and the accounts of the railroad investors. Then Eliza saw her father's name. A cold dread washed over her as she read the final lines. Morris claimed that Mercer Hale had been slowly poisoning her father, adding a tincture of wolfsbane to the medicine the doctor prescribed. The goal was to cloud his mind, to make him docile and easily manipulated into signing away his land with the fraudulent loan. "I saw him do it," Morris had written, his own hand shaking so badly the words were nearly illegible. "He knows that I know. This letter is my only hope for justice. If you are reading this, I am likely dead. The ledger is the proof. God forgive me." Eliza dropped the letter as if it had burned her. The room swayed. Her father had not just wasted away from sickness. He had been murdered. The debt that had nearly cost her her freedom was built on a foundation of theft and poison. The copied ledger was the proof, its pages filled with neat columns of figures and cryptic notations that meant nothing to her. But she knew, with chilling certainty, that they were the key. Someone, likely the doomed Abel Morris himself, had hidden the package in this cabin, entrusting it to the one man in the territory who lived outside Mercer Hale's influence. When Jonah came in from checking his snares, he found her sitting at the table, pale as a ghost. The letter and ledger laid out before her. He looked at the items, then at her face, and his own expression hardened. He read the letter in silence, his jaw clenching so tight a muscle jumped. For the first time, Eliza saw not just a quiet survivor, but a man capable of a cold and terrible rage. He had bought her to save her from a bad marriage. Now he saw he had stumbled into a fight for justice, a fight that was far more dangerous. They knew they could not act alone. A few nights later, under the cover of a moonless sky, they rode down to Nate Walker's ranch. Nate listened to their story in the dim light of his barn, his face grim. He examined the ledger, whistling softly through his teeth. "I ain't no bookkeeper," he said, "but I drove cattle for a man who marked his tallies like this. These ain't just numbers. They're codes, dates, shipments, names. This little drawing of a crossbar, that was his mark for the railroad." He pointed to another symbol. "And this looks like the character Mrs. Lynn puts on her medicine jars, the one for poison." Their next visit was to Mrs. Lynn, in the quiet, herb-scented back room of her laundry. The old woman looked at the ledger, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She confirmed Nate's suspicion. She traced a symbol with her long, delicate finger. "This means Black Snake Hills," she said. "It is where they mine the silver that does not get reported to the government. This one means a payment was made to a man from the marshal's office." She worked for an hour, helping them decipher the web of corruption, her calm demeanor a steadying influence. Before they left, she pressed a small, cloth-wrapped packet into Eliza's hand. "Ginseng for strength," she said, "and something else, for pain, or to make a man sleep if you must. Be careful. The snake is most dangerous when it is cornered." They returned to the cabin with a plan forming. A circuit judge, an incorruptible man named Harrison, was due in Cedar Hollow in 2 weeks for his seasonal review of the territory's legal affairs. That was their chance. They had to get the evidence to him, to present it in a way that Mercer Hale could not suppress with bribes or threats. But the mountain had its own plans. The sky, which had been a clear, promising blue, turned a bruised purple overnight. A late spring blizzard swept down from the high peaks, a sudden, violent return of winter. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and snow began to fall in a thick, blinding curtain. Within hours, the world was a sea of white. The fight for survival consumed them. The horses, huddled in their lean-to, shivered violently. "We have to get them moving," Jonah yelled over the wind, "or they'll freeze where they stand." They spent the next several hours in the maelstrom, fighting their way through waist-deep snow, forcing the frightened animals to walk in circles within the small clearing to keep their blood flowing. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole their breath and burned their lungs. Eliza's face was numb, her fingers clumsy and stiff, but she worked alongside Jonah, her fear replaced by a fierce, primal will to endure. When the horses were finally stable, they turned their attention to their food. With wolves likely driven down from the high country by the storm, their stores were in danger. They spent another hour digging a deep pit in the frozen earth beneath the cabin floorboards, lining it with stones, and burying their sacks of flour and salted meat, safe from scavengers. Finally, exhausted and half-frozen, they stumbled back inside, barring the door against the raging storm. They collapsed before the fire, shedding their snow-caked outer layers. They were too tired to speak, but a new understanding had passed between them in the shared struggle. They had faced the storm together and won. The cabin, once just a shelter, now felt like a fortress they had defended side by side. Later that night, as the wind rattled the window pane and the fire crackled in the hearth, the tension of the past weeks and the intimacy of their shared ordeal created an opening. Eliza looked at Jonah, at the old scars on his face, at the weariness in his eyes. The rumors about him seemed absurd now. She had seen the man, not the myth. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. 10 years ago, with the Kellermans." Jonah was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. She thought he would not answer, but then he began to speak, his voice low, the words coming out as if they had been locked away for a decade. "My father built this cabin. He said my mother planted the garden. When they passed, it was all I had left. The Kellermans wanted this land. Their cattle needed the water from the creek. They tried to buy me out. I said no. They tried to scare me out, sent men to tear down my fences, spook my livestock. I stood my ground." He paused, taking a deep breath. "One night, they came with torches. 4 of them, the father and his 3 sons. They were drunk and mean. They were going to burn the barn, with my horses inside. I came out with my rifle. I told them to leave. The old man, he laughed. He threw his torch onto the barn roof. The hay caught fire in a second. One of his boys, Vincent, the youngest, he raised his pistol to shoot me. I fired first." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of a nightmare. "I shot to wound him, to stop him, but he stumbled as I fired, and the bullet took him in the chest. The other 2 came at me. It was them or me. I defended my home. Eliza, I never went looking for trouble. They brought it to my door. When the smoke cleared, 3 of them were dead. The old man had a heart attack from the shock. Only Vincent, the one I shot first, lived. He was the one who went to town and told everyone I was a murderer, that I had ambushed them in cold blood. It was easier for people to believe his story. I was the quiet man on the mountain. They were a known family. So I stayed up here. I let them have their story." Eliza listened, her heart aching for the lonely, haunted man beside her. He carried not only the weight of the killings, but the heavier weight of a lie he had allowed to define him. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. The touch was hesitant, but it was the first time she had initiated contact. "You are not a murderer." "Jonah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are a good man." The storm broke 2 days later, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. The snow melted quickly in the strengthening sun, and the creeks began to run high and fast. The danger from the mountain had passed. But as Jonah stood outside the cabin, watching the pass below, he saw a new threat. A small group of men on horseback were at the base of the trail. They were not ranchers or trappers. They moved with a purpose, surveying the terrain, their eyes fixed on the high country. They were hunters, and the thaw had just opened the way to their quarry. The attack came in the gray hour before sunrise, a time when the world holds its breath. The air was still and cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and melting snow. A blue jay's sharp cry was the only sound, a sudden tear in the silence. It was that cry that woke Jonah. He was off the bench in an instant, moving with a fluid economy that was both silent and lethal. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door just as the first shot rang out. The bullet splintered the door frame, a vicious spit of lead that sent wood chips flying into the cabin. Eliza, startled from a deep sleep, sat bolt upright in the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Another shot shattered the single window pane, and the cold morning air rushed in. "Stay down," Jonah commanded, his voice a low growl. He did not need to say it twice. Eliza scrambled from the bed, crawling on her hands and knees to the relative safety of the stone hearth. Jonah moved to the side of the broken window, using the solid log wall as cover. He peered out for a fraction of a second, then ducked back. "3 of them," he said, his voice tight, spread out by the tree line. "They think they have us pinned." He raised his rifle, fired a single, calculated shot, and was rewarded with a curse from the woods. Eliza watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. This was not a fight he could win alone. They were trapped. She thought of the rifle in the corner, the one he had taught her to use. Her hands trembled, but her mind was clear. She crawled to the corner, her fingers closing around the cool wood and steel of the weapon. It felt impossibly heavy. She checked the load as he had shown her, her movements clumsy but deliberate. She crawled to the other side of the cabin, near the wall with the cupboard. There was a small gap between 2 of the logs, a chinking of clay that had fallen away. No bigger than her fist. It was a poor vantage point, but it was something. She pressed the rifle barrel through the opening, the cold air chilling her cheek as she sighted down its length. She could see one of the men, a silhouette moving between 2 large pines. He was reloading. She remembered Jonah's words. Breathe, squeeze. She aimed not at the man, but at the trunk of the tree beside him. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, the sound of the shot deafening in the small cabin. Bark exploded from the tree, and the man yelped, diving for cover. She had not hit him, but she had announced her presence. She had made them fight a battle on 2 fronts. The brief distraction was all Jonah needed. He fired again, and a cry of pain echoed from the woods. A third man, seeing his companions falter, broke cover and ran toward the cabin, firing his pistol wildly. Jonah swung his rifle around, but the man was too close, too fast. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Jonah's coat, and he grunted in pain as another slug slammed into the logs beside his head. He stumbled back, a dark stain spreading rapidly on his shoulder. "He's down," Eliza thought, a wave of pure terror washing over her. But he was not. He staggered to his feet, his face pale, his left arm hanging useless at his side. He raised his rifle one-handed, but his aim was unsteady. Eliza knew she had to act. She shoved the barrel of her own rifle back through the gap and fired again, this time at the ground in front of the charging man. The bullet kicked up a spray of mud and half-melted snow. The man hesitated for a single, crucial second. It was enough. Jonah, his jaw set, fired his rifle from the hip. The shot was a roar, and the man outside was thrown backward, landing in a heap in the snow. Silence. The 2 remaining attackers, seeing their partner fall and realizing the fight was not as one-sided as they had imagined, dragged their wounded companion back into the deep woods. The ambush was over as quickly as it had begun. Eliza scrambled to Jonah's side. He was leaning against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The front of his shirt was soaked with blood, a dark, pulsing red that seemed to steal the very warmth from the room. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder, but it was high and dangerously close to his chest. She had to stop the bleeding. Her mind raced, fumbling for a solution. A bandage. She needed cloth, clean and thick. She looked around the cabin in a panic. The linens were in the cupboard, but she could not get to them without exposing herself to the broken window. Her eyes fell on her own clothes. Her flannel nightgown was too thin. Without a second thought, she ripped at the front of her heavy wool coat, but the fabric would not tear. Desperate, frantic, she unbuttoned her coat, her fingers fumbling. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton blouse. It would have to do. Her hands went to the small pearl buttons, working them free with a desperate haste. She tore the fabric open, exposing the pale skin of her collarbone and the soft linen of her chemise to the cold air. She did not feel the chill. She ripped a long, wide strip from the front of her blouse. Jonah watched her, his eyes glazed with pain. He saw her face, etched with a fierce determination he had never seen before. He saw the frantic movement of her hands, the torn fabric, the shocking vulnerability of her exposed skin in the dim morning light. A shudder went through him that had nothing to do with the cold or the pain. For a decade he had lived behind walls of his own making, a fortress of solitude. In one terrifying, selfless act, she had breached them all. He whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. God help me. Eliza pressed the folded strip of cotton against the wound, her small hands firm. The bleeding was heavy, escaping from between her fingers. It is not enough pressure, she said, more to herself than to him. I need more pressure. Jonah pushed himself off the wall. He turned, his body swaying, and pressed his chest against her hands, trapping them between his body and the wound. He leaned his weight into her, his head dropping forward until his forehead rested against her shoulder. His body was a wall of heat and trembling muscle. His warm blood soaked the makeshift bandage, seeping onto her hands, her chemise. Their breath mingled in the cold air, coming in short, ragged puffs. He was so close she could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her own. It was a moment of terrifying, profound intimacy. Stripped of all pretense, a raw and desperate fight for life, in the wreckage of the dawn attack, huddled together in the cold. They were no longer a man and a woman bound by a strange contract. They were two souls clinging to each other on the edge of a precipice, their survival suddenly, fiercely intertwined. After a long time, the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Jonah, weak from blood loss, allowed her to guide him to the chair by the fire. The immediate danger was past, but the wound was ragged and deep. It needed to be cleaned and stitched. Eliza's hands were shaking now, a delayed reaction to the violence and the fear, but her mind was steady. She pulled out the leather-bound journal, Jonah's mother's book, and found the section on treating gunshot wounds. The script was calm and clear, a voice of sanity from the past. She boiled water, her movements becoming more sure, more confident. She laid out a clean needle and thread from her sewing kit. She found the jar of carbolic acid Jonah kept for disinfecting traps and cleaned the wound as the book instructed, her touch surprisingly gentle. Jonah bore the stinging pain with a stoic silence, his eyes never leaving her face. Then came the stitching. She had only ever stitched cloth, never flesh, but she followed the diagrams in the book, pushing the needle through his skin, pulling the thread taut, her stomach churning with each careful stitch. She worked for nearly an hour, her brow furrowed in concentration, until the ugly, gaping wound was closed. When she was finished, she bandaged it properly with clean linen from the cupboard. She helped him drink some water laced with the willow bark infusion the journal recommended for pain. He leaned back in the chair, his face ashen but his breathing easier. The cabin was a wreck, the floor littered with broken glass and wood splinters, the air thick with the metallic smell of blood and gunpowder. But they were alive. He looked at her, at the torn front of her blouse, at the smudges of his own blood on her cheek, at the unwavering strength in her eyes. He had run from the world for 10 years, content to let a lie be his shield, but he was not just hiding himself anymore. He was hiding her, and that was a price he was no longer willing to pay. "When we get down the mountain," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a new resolve, "we will tell the truth. All of it. No more running." Eliza nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She went to the hearth and added a fresh log to the fire. It caught quickly, sending a plume of thick, gray smoke curling up the stone chimney. Outside, the smoke rose into the crisp morning air, a straight, unwavering column against the backdrop of the pines and the snow. It was a sign of warmth, of life, of a home defended. And to the men watching from the woods below, it was a clear and unmistakable signal. They did not wait for the bounty hunters to make the next move. As Jonah's shoulder began the slow, painful process of healing, they planned their descent. The main trail was a death trap, watched from the woods by men who had already shown their willingness to kill. But Mrs. Lynn had provided another way. Years ago, before the vein ran dry, miners had dug a ventilation shaft from a high ridge down into the labyrinth of the Black Snake silver mine. The mine's main entrance opened just behind the town livery, a place of constant noise and activity where a woman emerging from the shadows might go unnoticed. It was a dark, dangerous path, but it was their only one. The plan was simple and desperate. Jonah, his arm in a sling but his resolve like iron, would create a diversion. At dusk, when the shift change at the rail yard brought the most men in confusion to the east end of town, he would draw Mercer's hired guns away from the town's center. That would give Eliza the opening she needed to slip out of the mine and find Judge Harrison, who was staying at the Cedar Hollow Hotel. She would carry the oilcloth package with the letter and the ledger, their only weapons against a man who owned the town's guns and its laws. They set out 2 days later, under the cover of a thick mountain fog. Jonah's face was pale, and a feverish heat radiated from his bandaged shoulder, but he moved with a grim determination. At the ridge, they found the shaft entrance hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown hawthorn bushes. It was a black, gaping hole in the earth, exhaling a damp, mineral scent of absolute darkness. "There is a ladder," Jonah said, his voice low. "It is old, but the rungs are oak. Test each one before you put your weight on it. The tunnel at the bottom leads west. Stay to the left when it forks. Do not stop until you see daylight." He handed her a lantern and a small pouch containing a pistol, smaller than the rifle, but just as deadly. His good hand cupped her cheek for a moment, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. His touch was rough but surprisingly gentle. "Be careful, Eliza." She wanted to say 1,000 things. She wanted to tell him not to go, not to risk himself, to come with her through the darkness. But she saw the necessity in his eyes. He was drawing the fire so she could deliver the blow. She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I will." He watched her disappear into the blackness, then turned and made his way down the mountain toward the rail yard. A ghost moving through the fog. The descent into the mine was a journey into the grave. The lantern cast a small, flickering circle of light, pushing back a darkness so complete it felt solid. The air was cold and stale, tasting of wet rock and decay. The ladder was slick with moisture, and more than one rung groaned under her weight. But it held. At the bottom, she stood in a tunnel shored up with thick, rotting timbers. Water dripped from the ceiling, a steady, rhythmic beat like a slow clock ticking in the heart of the earth. She followed Jonah's instructions, her hand trailing along the cold, damp rock of the left wall. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water and the sound of her own frantic breathing. Fear was a living thing in the darkness, a cold presence at her back. But the memory of her father's stolen life and the image of Jonah's bloodied shirt pushed her forward. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity when she first heard it, a low, distant rumble that vibrated through the soles of her boots. It came from the direction of the town. Gunshots, a frantic series of them, followed by shouting. Jonah, his diversion had begun. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in time with the chaos above. In Cedar Hollow, all hell was breaking loose. Jonah had set a small fire in a shed full of tarred railroad ties at the edge of the rail yard. The thick, black smoke billowed into the evening sky, a beacon of alarm. As men ran toward the fire, Jonah fired his rifle into the air from a position behind a stack of lumber, then melted back into the shadows. Mercer's hired guns. thinking they had their quarry cornered, rushed toward the rail yard, leaving the center of town lightly guarded. At that moment, Eliza saw a sliver of gray light ahead. She emerged from the mine exit behind the livery, blinking in the dusky light, covered in grime and smelling of the earth. She pulled her cloak tight around her and slipped into the street, just another anonymous figure in the growing chaos. Judge Harrison was a formidable man with a square jaw and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was in his hotel room, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp. When Eliza knocked, he listened to her story without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she placed the oilcloth package on the table between them. She unwrapped it and pushed the blood-stained letter toward him first. He read it, his brow furrowed. He picked up the ledger, his fingers tracing the columns of figures and strange symbols. He looked up at her, his gaze sharp and piercing. "This is a serious accusation. Mrs. Creed. To level it against a man like Mercer Hale, you will need more than this." "I will swear to it," Eliza said, her voice shaking but clear. "I will testify to everything. To the debt, to the marriage auction, to the attack on our cabin. This is the truth." The judge stared at her for a long moment, weighing the dirt-smudged, earnest woman against the powerful, respectable man who controlled the town. He saw the truth in her eyes. He stood and walked to the window. The sounds of the disturbance from the rail yard were now joined by a new noise, an angry roar from the direction of the town square. Mercer Hale stood on the porch of the saloon, a bottle of whiskey in one hand. He had realized the fire was a ruse, a trick to pull his men away. He knew, with a sick certainty, what was happening. He wasted no time. He addressed the crowd of confused and agitated townspeople, his voice ringing with false concern. "They have taken her," he roared, pointing vaguely toward the mountains. "That animal, Creed, has filled her head with lies. He has her under his spell, a prisoner in his own home. I have it on good authority she is being held against her will. Are we to stand by and let this happen, to let a monster steal one of our own? We must rescue her." His words were like a torch to dry tinder. The crowd, already on edge from the gunfire and stirred by the old rumors about Jonah, began to shout in agreement. A mob, drunk on fear and righteousness, began to surge toward the hotel. Suddenly, a horse and rider cut through the crowd. It was Nate Walker, his face set in a grim line. He reined his horse to a stop in front of the hotel steps, creating a barrier between the mob and the door. "Leave the lady be," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "She is here on her own business." The church bell began to toll, a frantic clanging alarm. The train whistle shrieked again from the rail yard. Sporadic gunshots popped in the evening air. The town had descended into madness. Inside the hotel room, Eliza heard the roar of the mob. Her eyes darted to the window. Then she heard a single shot, closer than the others, from the direction of the church, the bell tower. Her blood ran cold. Jonah. He was trapped. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, to abandon everything and go to him. She took a step toward the door. "You will do no such thing," Judge Harrison said, his voice like stone. He had seen the shift in the crowd, heard Mercer's words. He knew what was happening. "You will stay here and finish what you started. Your testimony, Mrs. Creed. Right now." He pulled out a Bible and a fresh sheet of paper. Eliza was torn. Every instinct screamed for her to run to Jonah's side, but the judge's logic was a cold, hard anchor. To save Jonah, to save them both. She had to see this through. Her duty and her heart were at war, with tears welling in her eyes. She placed her hand on the Bible and began to speak, her voice a low, steady counterpoint to the symphony of chaos outside. Jonah was pinned down in the belfry. He had drawn them away, but now 3 of them were in the street below, using the church walls for cover. He was a perfect target. He returned fire sparingly, his shoulder a burning agony. A bullet ricocheted off the great bronze bell. The sound a deafening clang in the small space, and a splinter of lead grazed his cheek, drawing blood. He was trapped, and his gambit had cost him. As Eliza finished her sworn statement, Judge Harrison moved with swift authority. He deputized his young clerk, a pale but determined man, and the hotel owner. "At dawn," he said, "we move." He signed the warrant for Mercer Hale's arrest. Then he dispatched the hotel owner. "Go to the bank. Tell no one your purpose. Do not let anyone near the safe." The sun rose on a town exhausted by its own frenzy. The mob had dispersed, but an uneasy tension remained. In the pale morning light, Judge Harrison, with his 2 deputies and Nate Walker, walked across the square to the bank. They found Mercer Hale inside, overseeing the morning's business as if nothing had happened. "Mercer Hale," the judge said, his voice carrying in the quiet room, "You are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and suspicion of murder." Mercer laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You have no authority here. Harrison, this is my town." The judge simply held up the warrant. As the clerk placed the iron cuffs on Mercer's wrists, the banker's confident smirk finally vanished, replaced by a look of pure, cold fury. They led him out into the square, a prisoner in the very place he had ruled. As he passed the hotel, he looked up at the window where he knew Eliza was watching. His eyes were not the eyes of a defeated man. They were chips of steel, promising retribution. "I still have people," he said, his voice a low threat meant only for her. "This is not over." The ride out of Cedar Hollow was a silent one. The chaos of the previous night had receded, leaving behind an unnerving quiet, the kind that follows a fever. Mercer Hale was in custody. The ledger was in the hands of the law, but the victory felt fragile, incomplete. Jonah's arm was still in a sling, the graze on his cheek a stark reminder of how close he had come to death in the belfry. Eliza rode beside him, the grime of the mine washed away, but its chill still clinging to her bones. They were heading home, back to the cabin on Elk Trace Pass. But the path between the world of men and the world of the mountain had never felt longer or more treacherous. To avoid the main trails, they took a winding, little-used route that cut through a narrow chasm known as Black Snake Canyon. It was a grim, shadowed place where the rock walls rose up on either side, so close in spots that a man could touch both walls at once. The trail was littered with loose shale that shifted and slid under the horses' hooves, and the air was cold, holding the memory of a winter that did not want to let go. It was a place that encouraged silence, a place to be passed through quickly. They were halfway through the narrowest part of the canyon when the trap was sprung. They did not appear from the front or the back, but from the rock itself. 5 men stepped out from behind fissures and boulders, materializing from the shadows with rifles in their hands. They blocked the path forward and the path back. At their head was a man with a haunted, familiar face and eyes that burned with a cold, 10-year-old fire. It was Vincent Kellerman. He was no longer the boy Jonah remembered, but a man hardened by a singular, consuming purpose. The wound Jonah had given him had left him with a slight limp and a perpetual sneer on his face. He held a pistol, its barrel aimed squarely at Jonah's chest. "Well now, Creed," Vincent said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Look what the mountain coughed up. I heard you were playing the hero down in town. Funny, the only thing I remember you being is a killer." Jonah reined in his horse, his body tensing. His rifle was in its scabbard, out of reach. His pistol was on his hip, but he was a one-armed man facing 5. He looked at Vincent, his own eyes holding no fear, only a deep, profound weariness. His past had finally caught up to him on this forgotten trail. Eliza's heart seized in her chest. She looked at the faces of the men with Vincent. They were not bounty hunters. They were ranchers from the next valley, men whose families had known the Kellermans for generations. This was not about money. This was about blood. "You came to my home with torches, Vincent," Jonah said, his voice even. "You came to burn me out. Your family left me no choice." Vincent laughed, a bitter, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "No choice, you gunned down my father and my brothers in cold blood. You hid in the dark and shot them down like dogs. You took everything from me." "I took nothing you were not trying to steal," Jonah replied, his voice hardening. "I defended what was mine. I regret the lives that were lost that night, but I will not apologize for protecting my home." "It does not matter," Vincent said, raising his pistol higher. "The talking is done. 10 years I have waited for this day, to pay you back for what you did, to make things right." Eliza watched the scene unfold, a nightmare playing out in the cold canyon light. She saw the unyielding rage in Vincent Kellerman's eyes and the grim acceptance in Jonah's. This was a circle of violence, a wheel of vengeance that had been turning for a decade, and it was about to crush them both. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that a gun could not stop this. Only a different kind of strength could. Slowly, deliberately, she swung her leg over her horse and slid to the ground. The men tensed, their rifles shifting toward her. "Stay on the horse, Eliza," Jonah commanded, his voice sharp with alarm. She ignored him. She stood on the shifting shale of the trail, a small, unarmed woman between two factions of armed, angry men. She looked directly at Vincent Kellerman, her eyes holding not fear but a deep, sorrowful compassion. "What will making things right look like, Mr. Kellerman?" she asked, her voice clear and steady in the tense silence. "Will you shoot him? And what, then, will I then have to spend the next 10 years waiting in a canyon for my chance to make things right with you? Where does it end?" Vincent stared at her, momentarily thrown off by her courage. "Who are you to speak of this? This is family business. This is about what he did to us." "He did what he had to do to survive," she said, taking a small step forward. "Just as you have done. But you are not just the sum of what was done to you. You are more than that. I have learned that. You can be too. This need for vengeance, it is a prison. It has kept you here, in this canyon, for 10 years. Has it not? You have not been free for a single day." "What would you know of freedom?" Vincent sneered. "He bought you like a horse." "He gave me a life when I had none," she countered, her voice ringing with conviction. "He gave me a home, and what you plan to do now will not restore your family. It will only destroy what is left of your own soul." She took another step, her hands open at her sides to show she was unarmed. She was close enough now to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The war between the man he was and the boy he had once been. "Your mother?" "She was a friend of my mother's," Eliza said softly. "She said you were a gentle boy. She said you had a kindness about you. She called you Vinny." The name, a relic from a time before the hatred, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He flinched. The hand holding the pistol trembled slightly. "That boy would not want this," Eliza continued, her voice a near whisper. "He would not want his life to be defined by a single night of fire and pain. He would want justice, not revenge. There is a difference. Justice builds. Revenge only burns what is left." She held out her empty, ungloved hand. "Please, Vinny, choose to build." The canyon held its breath. The only sound was the wind whispering over the rock. Vincent Kellerman stared at her outstretched hand, then at Jonah's unyielding face, then back to her. The ghosts of his father and brothers were at his back, demanding blood. But the woman before him was offering something else, something he had forgotten existed, a choice. At that moment, a low rumble started deep within the earth. It grew quickly to a grinding roar. High above them, the canyon wall shuddered. Rocks and scree, loosened by the spring thaw, began to cascade down the steep slope. It was not a massive landslide, but it was enough. Boulders the size of barrels tumbled down, crashing onto the trail ahead of them, shaking the very ground they stood on. Both groups scrambled back instinctively, their personal conflict dwarfed by the raw, indifferent power of the mountain. The horses whinnied in terror, their eyes wide. The rock slide was over in seconds. leaving a cloud of dust and a fresh pile of rubble blocking the path. It was as if the mountain itself had passed judgment, a stern warning to the foolish mortals who dared to bring their petty hatreds into its domain. The spell was broken. Vincent Kellerman slowly lowered his pistol. He looked at the impassable trail, then at Eliza, and a decade of rage seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind an emptiness that was somehow even heavier. "She is right," he said, his voice hollow. "Living with the memory is a harder thing than dying for it." He turned to his men. "Let us go." He looked one last time at Jonah, his eyes no longer filled with fire, but with a vast, empty landscape of loss. "Stay on your mountain. Creed! Do not come down again and bring harm to anyone else." Without another word, he and his men turned and picked their way back through the canyon, their quest for vengeance buried under a pile of freshly broken rock. Jonah and Eliza stood in silence, watching them go. The dust settled, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending a single shaft of golden light into the dark canyon. Jonah turned his head and looked at Eliza. He did not look at her as a woman he had rescued, or as a partner in a desperate fight. He looked at her as if he were seeing the sunrise for the first time after a long and starless night. She had not saved his life with a gun, but with a courage he had never known. She had faced down his past and offered it not a challenge, but grace. In that moment, he saw the way out of the prison he had lived in for 10 years. The way out was her. They cleared a narrow path through the rockfall and continued their journey upward. As they finally emerged from the mouth of Black Snake Canyon, the sun was setting, painting the high peaks in hues of orange and rose. Below them, nestled in its clearing, was the cabin. A thin ribbon of smoke still curled from the chimney, a leftover from their morning fire. The house was still standing. The hearth was still warm. They were home. The weeks that followed their return from Black Snake Canyon were quiet, a deep, healing quiet that settled over the cabin and the mountainside like a fresh fall of snow. Jonah's shoulder mended, the neat line of Eliza's stitches fading into a puckered scar that would forever mark the day their lives truly became one. The fever left him, and with it, the last of the hunted look he had worn for a decade. He still moved with the silence of a man accustomed to solitude, but there was a new ease in his posture, a lightness that had not been there before. He began to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small observations about the way a hawk circled on the updraft, or the best place to find wild onions. He was teaching her the language of his world, and she was a quick study. Nate Walker brought them the news from town. He would ride up every few days, a welcome visitor who brought not just supplies, but the story of Cedar Hollow's slow, painful rebirth. Judge Harrison, true to his word, had been a force of nature, armed with the ledger and Eliza's sworn testimony. He had unraveled Mercer Hale's empire of deceit with methodical precision. The investigation had uncovered years of embezzlement, fraudulent land claims, and a network of bribery that reached all the way to the territorial capital. The most damning evidence came from the bank's safe. Behind a false panel, they found the original ledger that matched Abel Morris's copy, along with vials of the same wolfsbane poison misses. Lynn had identified. Mercer Hale was charged with a litany of crimes, the murder of Eliza's father chief among them. His assets, his fine house, his land holdings, and his shares in the railroad were all seized by the court. A public auction was held in the town square, the very place where Eliza had once been put on display. This time, the assets were sold off not to enrich one man, but to repay a community. The Federal Relief Fund was restored, every stolen dollar accounted for. Families who had lost their land to Hale's predatory loans were given their deeds back, their debts erased. Cedar Hollow, a town that had been slowly suffocating under the thumb of one man's greed, was beginning to breathe again. It was nearly a month before Jonah and Eliza rode down into town together. The visit was necessary. They needed seeds for the spring planting and other supplies they could not make or hunt. But it was more than that. It was a test. As they rode down the main street, The change was palpable. The stares they received were not of scorn or fear, but of a quiet, hesitant respect. People nodded to them. A few even offered a shy hello. The name Jonah Creed was no longer a curse whispered in the shadows. It was the name of the man who had helped break the town's chains. At the general store, Nate Walker met them, a wide grin on his face. He told them that Judge Harrison, before leaving town, had made a final entry into the public record. He had interviewed several old-timers during the Hale investigation, people who had been too afraid to speak before. Their testimony, combined with the evidence of the attack on the cabin, corroborated Jonah's story of the night the Kellermans died. The judge had officially declared the case a clear and justifiable act of self-defense. The rumor that 10-year-old Poison was finally dead and buried under the weight of the law. While Jonah conducted his business, Eliza walked to the small building that served as the schoolhouse. It had been closed for months, a casualty of the town's stolen funds. Now, the windows were open, and the sound of children reciting their letters spilled out into the afternoon air. A new teacher had been hired. In the yard, a young girl with her father's serious eyes and dark hair was sweeping the porch. It was Sarah Morris, Abel's daughter. Eliza approached her quietly. "Hello, Sarah." The girl looked up, her expression guarded at first, then softening as she recognized Eliza. She had been living with relatives, a forgotten victim of Hale's cruelty. Eliza told her about the auction, about the restored funds. She explained that the town council, with the judge's encouragement, had established a scholarship from the proceeds. It was named for her father, to honor his courage. It would pay for her schooling, for books, for anything she needed to make a new start. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first she had allowed herself to cry in a long time. "Thank you," she whispered. "My father, he would be so happy." "I know he would," Eliza said, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "He was a good man, and you will make him proud." From that day on, Eliza took Sarah under her wing, mentoring her, helping her with her studies, and ensuring that the memory of Abel Morris was one of honor, not tragedy. That evening, back in the quiet of the cabin, Jonah sat by the fire, turning something over and over in his good hand. The flames glinted off the object, a small circle of dull, gray metal. He had been spending his evenings in the small shed he used as a workshop, the sound of a hammer on metal a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. He had found a small, pure vein of silver ore high up on the mountain, in a place only he knew. For weeks, he had been patiently working it, hammering and shaping it with a skill Eliza never knew he possessed. He stood and walked over to where she sat at the table, mending one of his shirts. He opened his hand. Lying in his calloused palm was a simple silver ring. It was not perfect. It was a little uneven, marked by the hammer, but it shone with a soft, honest light all its own. "Eliza," he said, his voice quiet, "the first time, in the church, that was a bargain, a way to get you out of a bad situation. It was about a debt." He looked down at the ring, then back up at her, his eyes holding a depth of emotion that stole her breath. "This is not about a debt. This is for you. If you will have it, if you will have me. We started this backwards, but I would like to start it again, the right way. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. She held out her hand, and he slid the cool, heavy silver ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Yes, Jonah, I will." Their second wedding was nothing like the first. It was held on a bright Sunday morning in the same church, but the building felt different, as if its very timbers had been cleansed. A new priest, a kind, elderly man named Father O'Brien, officiated. There was no crowd of whispering gossips, only a handful of friends. Nate Walker stood beside Jonah. Mrs. Lynn sat in the front pew, a rare, gentle smile on her face. Even Judge Harrison, who had returned to town to oversee the final legal matters, was in attendance. When Jonah placed the silver ring on her finger again, this time with a sacred vow, it was not an escape, it was a destination. Life on Elk Trace Pass settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. They were a team, a true partnership. They planted the garden together, their hands in the same rich earth. The cabin began to grow. Jonah, with Nate's help, added a long, covered porch to the front, a place to sit in the evenings and watch the stars appear over the high peaks. Eliza planted bean vines, and soon a trellis of green leaves and delicate flowers climbed the posts of the new porch. One afternoon, she came out to find Jonah on the porch, a block of smooth, pale pine in his lap. He was carving, his knife moving with a slow, loving precision. He was making a cradle. The rockers were curved like the slope of the mountain, and the headboard was carved with the image of a soaring eagle. He was not just building a home for the two of them. He was building a home for the family they would become. That evening, they sat together on the new porch, her head resting on his good shoulder, his arm around her. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp soil. The sun had set, leaving the sky a wash of deep purple and fading orange. From the valley below, a sound drifted up to them on the quiet air, faint but clear. It was the sound of the evening church bell in Cedar Hollow, tolling the end of the day. It was not a sound of alarm or judgment, but a soft, melodic call to peace, a promise of a quiet night and a hopeful dawn. The sound floated over the forest, a signal that a time of turmoil was over, and a time of peace had begun. A year passed. The seasons turned on Elk Trace Pass, each one leaving its mark on the land and the two people who called it home. The fierce winter gave way to a gentle spring, where the creeks ran full and the wildflowers pushed up through the last of the snow. Summer came in a wave of warm pine scent and long, sunlit days. Autumn painted the aspens in strokes of brilliant gold before the first snows of the next winter came to dust the high peaks once more, beginning the cycle anew. It was in the quiet dawn of a morning poised between summer and fall that Eliza stood on the new porch, a heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. A year ago, she would have pulled it tight against her slender frame. Now, it draped over the gentle, firm swell of her belly, where their child grew in the safety of the mountain's silence. The air was crisp, carrying the first hint of the coming cold, but the sky to the east was a soft, promising shade of rose. The dawn was breaking, its pale light first touching the sharp ridge of the mountain opposite their cabin, what Jonah called the mountain's nose. The cabin door opened, and Jonah came out, a steaming tin cup of coffee in each hand. He had risen before her, as he always did, to stoke the fire and put the coffee on to boil. It was a small, unspoken ritual, a quiet act of care that had become the foundation of their mornings. He handed her a cup, his rough fingers brushing against hers. The coffee was strong and bitter, but the warmth of it was a welcome comfort, the same as it had been on their very first morning in this place, a lifetime ago. He stood beside her, not speaking, and they watched the light creep down the mountainside, chasing the shadows from the valley below. His presence was a solid, reassuring warmth at her side. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, the one that did not bear the scar. They had fallen into an easy, comfortable silence, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's hearts so well that words are often unnecessary. Later, as she was helping him into a fresh shirt, her fingers traced the familiar landscape of the scar on his shoulder. It was no longer an angry red line, but a pale, silvery mark, a permanent seal on his skin. He winced slightly, not from pain, but from the memory. "Does it ever ache?" she asked softly. "Only when a storm is coming," he said. "It is a better weather vane than the one on the livery roof." He looked down at her hand on his shoulder, then met her eyes. His gaze was serious, full of a quiet wonder. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low. If that bullet had been an inch lower or an inch to the side, if you had not been there. She placed her fingers gently on his lips, silencing him, but it was not, and I was... The scar was not a reminder of a wound. It was a testament to a choice. It was the mark of the moment he had stopped simply surviving and started fighting for a future. For her. It was the mark of the moment she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, a ferocity born of a love she was only just beginning to understand. It was the brand of their shared life, forged in blood and terror, and it was more sacred to her than any wedding vow. They had chosen to build. That was the simple truth of the life they had made. Jonah, a man who had spent a decade turning his back on the world, had instead turned his hands to creating. He had built the porch, the cradle, a new set of shelves for Eliza's growing collection of books, sent up to her by a grateful Sarah Morris. He had built a life, Eliza, a woman who had been a passive victim of fate, had learned to plant, to shoot, to heal, to speak truth to power. She had taken the shattered pieces of her life and, with Jonah's help, had built a new one, stronger and more beautiful than the old. Love, for them, had not been a sudden, blinding flash. It had been a slow and steady construction, a daily habit of kindness, a quiet choice made every morning to stoke the fire, to share a cup of coffee, to face the world together. Their life was simple, but it was rich. They worked the garden, hunted in the woods, and in the long evenings, she would read to him by the firelight from one of her books. She read him stories of faraway places, of kings and queens and great adventures. He would listen, his head leaned back, his eyes closed, and she knew that for all the world's wonders, there was no place he would rather be than in this small cabin, listening to the sound of her voice, as the sun climbed higher, flooding the valley with golden light. A great bald eagle lifted from its perch on a high pine. It circled once, its vast wingspan a dark silhouette against the brilliant blue sky, then soared out over the valley, a silent, majestic guardian of the wild domain. On the porch, a gentle breeze, a forerunner of the changing season, stirred the air. It slipped through the open cabin door and found the pine cradle that sat by the hearth, waiting. The cradle swayed gently on its rockers, a quiet, rhythmic motion, a promise of the life that was to come. Eliza looked down at her hand, at the simple, hammered silver ring on her finger. It was not a perfect circle, and it bore the marks of the man who had made it. As she turned her hand, it caught the bright morning sun, and for a moment, it flashed with a light so pure and brilliant it seemed to hold all the hope of the new day within it. It was the promise of this season and all the seasons yet to come. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.